concluding that it was untrue. Other reports circulated of Belgian women, often nuns, who had their breasts cut off by the Germans. A story appeared in the Times about German corpse factories, where bodies of British and French soldiers were supposedly turned into glycerin for weapons or food for hogs. The stories produced moral outrage throughout America and a hatred for the bloodthirsty Hun. Few realized that the news came from the British Pilgrim Society and was circulated by the Morgans and the Rockefellers, who had gained control of America's newspapers. On February 9, 1917, Congressman Oscar Callaway inserted this statement within the Congressional Record about Morgan's ability to control and manipulate the national news. In March 1915, the J.P. Morgan interests, the steel, shipbuilding, and powder interests, and their subsidiary organizations got together 12 men high up in the newspaper world and employed them to select the most influential newspapers in the United States, and sufficient number of them to control generally the policy of the daily press in the United States. These 12 men worked the problems out by selecting 179 newspapers, and then began, by an elimination process, to retain only those necessary for the purpose of controlling the general policy of the daily press throughout the country. They found it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest papers. The 25 papers were agreed upon. Emissaries were sent to purchase the policy, national and international, of these papers. An agreement was reached. The policy of the papers was bought, to be paid for by the month. An editor was furnished for each paper to properly supervise and edit information regarding the questions of preparedness, militarism, financial policies, and other things of national and international nature considered vital to the interest of the purchasers. This contract is in existence at the present time, and it accounts for the news columns of the daily press of the country being filled with all sorts of preparedness arguments and misrepresentations as to the present condition of the United States Army and Navy, and the possibility and probability of the United States being attacked by foreign foes. This policy also included the suppression of everything in opposition to the wishes of the interests served. The effectiveness of this scheme has been conclusively demonstrated by the character of the stuff carried in the daily press throughout the country since March 1915. They have resorted to anything necessary to commercialize public sentiment and sandbag the National Congress into making extravagant and wasteful appropriations for the Army and Navy under false pretense that it was necessary. Their stock argument is that it is patriotism. They are playing on every prejudice and passion of the American people. Safe for democracy. On April 6, 1917, the joint sessions of Congress approved President Wilson's request for a declaration of war against the German Empire. U.S. intervention in the conflict was justified by Wilson's belief that the war would make the world safe for democracy. 6 senators voted against the declaration, including Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, and 50 members of the House of Representatives opposed it, including Jeanette Rankin of Montana, America's first congresswoman. Despite government appeals for 1 million volunteers, only 63,000 enlisted in the first 6 weeks, forcing Congress to institute compulsory military conscription. Under the 1917 Espionage Act, hundreds of Americans who opposed the draft were tossed into prison, including political activist Eugene Debs, who said, "Let the capitalists do their own fighting and furnish their own corpses, and there will never be another war on the face of the earth." The military-industrial complex. The war gave rise to modern warfare. Huge plants sprouted up throughout the United States to produce military aircrafts, submarines, battleships, aircraft carriers, tanks, portable machine guns, flamethrowers, and automatic rifles. Military spending rose until it constituted 22% of the GNP in 1918. The principal beneficiaries were U.S. Steel, Bethlehem Steel, DuPont Chemical, Kennecott, and General Electric, all of which were related to the money cartel. Enterprising defense companies set up shop, including General Dynamics, which produced submarines, and Boeing, which produced aircraft. The military-industrial complex had come into existence. By the summer of 1914, the British Navy was fully committed to oil, and the British government had assumed the role of majority stockholder in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, now known as British Petroleum, BP. But 80% of the oil that was used to fuel the Royal Navy and Army came from America, and 90% of the oil in America was owned by the Rockefellers. War's End. On November 11, 1918, the Long War came to an end. Of the 2 million Americans who took part in the struggle, 116,000 were killed and 204,000 wounded. The European losses were staggering. 8 million soldiers and 6 to 10 million civilians were dead. The civilian casualties were caused by disease and starvation. No country suffered more than Russia, with 1.7 million dead and 5 million wounded. The survivors found themselves in a strange new world. Britain and France had been severely weakened and no longer represented a threat to the rising American political and economic hegemony. The German Empire had collapsed into financial shambles. The Austro-Hungarian Empire vanished, necessitating the restructuring of Eastern Europe. The Ottoman Empire, who had stood for 600 years, no longer ruled over the Middle East and Central Asia, and the reign of the Tsars in Russia had been overthrown by Bolshevik revolutionaries, who pledged to inaugurate a world revolution. The Treaty of Versailles. By the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed on July 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Germany lost 1/10 of her population and 1/8 of her territory. Germany's overseas empire, the third largest in the world, was torn apart and handed over to the victors. German citizens who lived in these German colonies were obliged to forfeit all of their personal property. Japan was given the German concession in Shantung and the German islands north of the equator. The German islands south of the equator were handed over to Australia and New Zealand. Germany's African colonies were shelled out to Britain, South Africa, and France. German waterways were now internationalized, and she was compelled to open her markets to Allied imports, but denied access to Allied markets. Germany was also required to cede to the Allies the city of Danzig and its hinterlands, including the delta of the Vistula River on the Baltic Sea. This last stipulation would spark World War II, since the Germans, residing in Danzig, would call on Adolf Hitler to liberate them from the clutches of the League of Nations. Reparations and revenge. But the loss of empire was only a part of the punishment. Germany was forbidden to build armored cars and tanks, to produce heavy artillery, and to maintain an air force. Her high seas fleet and merchant ships were confiscated as booty, and the German army was restricted to a force of 100,000 men. And then there was the matter of finances. Germany was required not only to pay the pensions of the Allied soldiers, but also to cough up 32 billion gold marks, an amount equivalent to the entire wealth of the country, in reparations. This indemnity would be used to repay the international bankers for the loans with interest that they had provided to Great Britain and France. By 1923, the reparation payments imposed upon Germany by the Treaty of Versailles had caused the Weimar Republic to print such an outrageous quantity of paper money that 100 million marks was not sufficient to buy a box of matches. The hyperinflation was accompanied by an unemployment rate that soared to 33%. When Germany was no longer able to come up with the mandated annual payments of 132 billion gold marks to the Allies, French and Belgian forces took possession of the Ruhr Valley. As a result of the occupation, German miners in this area reduced coal production. This situation intensified the financial crisis and poised the possibility of a renewed outbreak of armed conflict. The Dawes Plan. Within these dire developments, the Rockefellers spotted an opportunity to increase its wealth and came up with the Dawes Plan. As implemented in 1924, this plan called for the provision of $1.5 billion in loans from Morgan and Rockefeller to spark the German economy and to stabilize the German currency. Germany at that time represented carrion for the money vultures. The opportunities seemed limitless. Major German businesses could be bought for pennies on the dollar. The Daimler-Benz Motor Company, for example, could be had for the price of 227 of its cars. Some of the money was used to build theaters, sports stadiums, and even opera houses, but the lion's share went for industrialization. A German chemical company. The Dawes Plan was foolproof. It stipulated that the American bankers would be repaid with interest ahead of the reparation payments to France and Great Britain, and it met with immediate success. Businesses began to flourish, imports ballooned, and the austerity measures that had been imposed upon the German people were lifted. By 1926, the German government was back to running modest deficits of $200 million without inflation. A major beneficiary of the plan was I.G. Farben, who received a $30 million loan from Rockefeller's National City Bank. This funding allowed Farben to grow into the largest chemical company in the world. It produced 100% of Germany's synthetic oil, 100% of its lubricating oil, and 84% of its explosives. German bankers on the Farben Aufsichtsrat, the supervisory board of directors, included the Hamburg banker Max Warburg, whose brother Paul Warburg was a founder of the Federal Reserve System in the United States. Not coincidentally, in 1928, Paul Warburg became a director of American I.G. Farben's wholly owned U.S. subsidiary, whose holdings came to include the Bayer Company, General Aniline Works, Agfa Ansco, and Winthrop Chemical Company. By 1933, Farben had become so wealthy that it could fund the Nazi Party's rise to power. The ties to Hitler greatly increased the chemical company's worth. By 1943, it was the leading producer of Zyklon B gas, which was used in the concentration camps.